Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about dynamic range. Fancy word, very simple subject, but very important to understand both in your picture and in your camera's ability to capture dynamic range. So this is dynamic range. Enjoy. Before we go into dynamic range, we've got to understand luminosity, luminance. And what luminance is quite simply the brightness of displays in an image, the bright areas and the dark areas. Now, regardless of how much color they have, they are a certain level of brightness or darkness, and that effectively is your dynamic range. The distance between the dark areas and the distance between the bright areas and everything in between. That is dynamic range. Now, the level of dynamic range varies with every single image. You can get an image with high dynamic range will have a lot of information all the way from black or almost black to all the way to white or almost white, and a lot of information in between. Now, it's very important to understand too that cameras themselves have varying capacity to capture dynamic range. Professional cameras, more expensive cameras, have a much wider dynamic range, meaning they can capture more details in the very dark areas as well as more details in the very bright areas, which essentially means you capture more details within the image. And this can help greatly for many reasons. The obvious ones, you get more detail. The less obvious ones, when you try and save details that might be blown out in the highlights or might be blown out in the dark areas, areas that got too dark, in order to expose your subject correctly. A camera with high dynamic range means you can save those details later. A camera with low dynamic range, if you try and retract those details, whether it's the highlights or the shadows, you'll see you lose a lot of detail. So it does help having a camera that can capture a wide dynamic range, because it gives us the creative ability to expose images outside of normal exposures. And what I mean by that is we've spoken about the shadows before in previous chapters and how we can use shadows to bank details if it means purposefully underexposing our subject to reserve details. With a lot of dynamic range, we can drift outside of normal exposures and reserve details and highlights and shadows intentionally in order to create either an artistic approach or simply to reserve details in those areas that we can retract in post-processing. So that's dynamic range, the range between the dark areas and the light areas inside your image, and your camera's ability to pick up details further into the highlights or shadows. The more dynamic range your camera can absorb, the better, as it gives you the ability to expose the image outside of what's considered normal in order to reserve details in certain areas. I hope you enjoyed and I hope that makes sense. Cheers.